if Geoffrey does join us, he had some really interesting corrections to make. He's a Jewish ethnomusicologist, and so he knows a lot more than I do about the ta'amim, or the ta'amei hamikra, the trope marks. And I'm going to have Geoffrey, I'll take what he wrote to me, because he gave me a much more detailed history about the trope marks for Tehillim themselves, for Psalms, that make them quite different than the other trope marks, which I did not know. So luckily we have an ethnomusicologist, a Jewish ethnomusicologist as part of our community, and we'll take advantage of everything that he knows when we can. I think it was shared as well. Some people didn't understand what I was referring to about the trope marks, and Harold very helpfully photocopied a piece of Psalm 1. Did that get shared with everybody? With the trope mark circled. So I'm going to just clarify that a little bit. I'm going to clarify that a little bit. Whoops, did I just lose everybody?
No, you're there, Rabbi. You're here, Rabbi. And you're there.
We're still here.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Appreciate your support. So going back to the issue before we dive into Psalm number 1 is the question about musical notations, which I began discussing yesterday. So all Jewish scripture, all Jewish holy texts have been given musical notation marks, which we think, and if Geoffrey's on, and I'm going to ask him later to be sure, are from around the year 700 to 900 of the Common Era. So while that's ancient from our perspective, it's probably 1,000 years after the text was actually verbally in an oral tradition passed around our community, and then written down around 1,000 years before that. So those musical notation marks don't necessarily tell us how they were sung in the times of the ancient temple. We simply don't know. It's probably much more recent than that, meaning 2,000 years ago, as opposed to 3,000 years ago. But they do tell us what the tradition is of our people of emphasizing, of giving color and flavor to the words, and teaching us how the rabbinic tradition understood interpreting the sentences. But that still doesn't tell us how we sang this in the time of the temple. But the Tamei Hamikra, the trope marks, those musical notations, are different in the different Jewish traditions. So, for instance, Ashkenazic trope marks are the same marks, but they're sung differently if you're from Poland than if you're from Yemen or North Africa. So there have some differences. I see Geoffrey has joined us. Geoffrey, would you unmute yourself and tell us what you taught me about the Psalm system of trope marks? And I have to let my dog Penny out of the room, or into the room. She's very anxious to have the door closed. Excuse me, Geoffrey, can you tell us?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay.
Thank you, Geoffrey.
The trope signs in the book of Psalms is a different system from the trope signs in all the other books. And these trope signs are shared with two other books in the Bible, Proverbs, that's Mishlei, and Job, Eov, and they're known as Ta'amei Emet. Most of the trope signs look the same and have the same names, but other trope signs are different and have different names. But the big question is, are these musical signs like they are, say, for the Torah and Haftarah? Well, this is a big debate amongst musicologists. And it seems that they're only, in a very loose sense, musicological. They're primarily syntactical, where there are divisions, which words are joined with other words, where there's a break. But the musical traditions of, say, the Yemenites or the Kurdish Jews, they seem to be primarily different or don't represent the actual trope signs that we see. And according to at least one musicologist, the melodies that are sung, say, by the Yemenites or the Kurdish Jews, are older than the trope creations of the Masoretes. I hope some of that makes sense.
Jeffrey, hi.
Yeah.
So you're talking about, so the melodies are different in many different tropes. Many melodies.
Yes.
What you're referring to is that the punctuation here, because the tropes really serve as punctuation in the tropes that I know.
Yes,
and I'm wondering if that's what you're pointing out, is that the punctuation is different.
But that, just think, we have two types of the word musics. Just think of the chanting of the Bible. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, strictly according to trope. Then there's another musical group that we call psalmody. A good example, chanting Ashrei. Ashrei yoshvei beitecha, od halelucha selah, Ashrei ham she'adon she'eloha. Forgot the words. Anyway, so on and so forth. If you compare with what I just sang with the actual text and the tropes of that psalm in the book of Psalms, there's little correspondence. There's like a semicolon in the middle, and then there's a full stop at the end. But apart from that, the melody that I just sang has little correlation to the trope signs. They're sort of ignored.
Well, thank you so much, Geoffrey. And as I said before, we're so grateful to have somebody that knows what you know. And so I'm delighted that you could correct me. And I honestly had no idea that the trope for Tehillim were so different. So I appreciate it very much. Some people have asked for a tutorial in actually using Zoom. So what we're going to do tomorrow is that 15 minutes before the class, so at 9:45, for those of you for whom this is new, which means me too, we're going to ask people who are new to get on at 9:45. And if somebody in the group actually knows how to do this, I'd appreciate somebody volunteering to do a 15-minute tutorial to teach everybody how to actually use this medium. Does that sound like a good idea? I think we're all struggling a little bit. So send in the chat if you could teach, and then at 9:45 we're going to have a tutorial to help everybody get up to speed. And thank you, Geoffrey, for that. All of this is about learning Torah, and we're continuing learning the Torah of Psalms. So as I said yesterday, the book of Psalms has 150 chapters, and those chapters are the chapters are divided into 5 sub-books of the book of Psalms. Today, we are starting our journey into those 150 chapters, and it is my commitment to keep studying with you to get through all 150, however long it takes. And as I said, some Psalms are very short, 5-6 verses, and some Psalms are quite long. We won't necessarily go through every detail of every Psalm, but I'll pick out different things to choose to teach you. And I would also add, if you've been a part of the CBST Psalms project, now is a really good time to start if you've let it drop, or continue with strength reading your daily Psalm. And I strongly encourage everybody to pick one Psalm that becomes theirs, and we're happy to help you choose one. But sometimes it's good to arbitrarily be assigned or pick one, and it will become yours. So let's turn to Psalm number 1, the first Psalm of the first book of the 5 books of Psalms, or the first Psalm of the entire book itself. Now, I think we have shared 2 translations. Is that correct? Where would they be? Scott, can you tell us how people can find the 2 translations that we put up? I see one is in chat, the one translation. And then I asked for Judy Hollander to put up her translation, but do we have that one as well? All right, well, we're going to start, and then it's fine if you have your own translation, because as I said, we're going to work with the Hebrew, and every translation ends up being an insight to the translation process, which becomes translation is really interpretation. So having multiple translations helps us to look at the Psalms in all different kinds of ways. So as I said, I'm going to be using my the book that I carry around with me all the time, which is the Mitsuda Linear Psalms. It's not a beautiful translation, but it's in one book. I can soft covered and easy to carry, have 150 Psalms with the Hebrew and the English. As I said, we're going to look, and so let's look at the first Psalm. Keep yourself on mute, but let's read it through together once in Hebrew and in English, all together. Those of you who can read Hebrew, read it in Hebrew, and those who can't, wait, and then we'll read it. Whatever translation you have in front of you, we'll read it through together, okay? Starting with the Hebrew, and I have to take off my glasses to read, of course. Ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach ba'atzat risha'im uvederech chataim lo amad uvemoshav leitzim lo yashav. Ki im b'torat Adonai cheftzo uv'torato yehege yomam v'layla. V'haya ka'etz shatul al palgei mayim asher piryo yiten bi'ito v'alehu lo yibol v'chol asher ya'aseh yatzliach. Lo chen harisha'im ki im kamotz asher tidfenu ruach. Al ken lo yakumu risha'im b'mishpat v'chata'im ba'adat tzadikim. Ki yodea Adonai derech tzadikim v'derech risha'im toved. And now in English, whatever English you have in front of you, or if your native language is not English, feel free to read it in whatever is your vernacular. Fortunate is the man who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, and in the way of the sinful he has not stood. In the seat of the scornful he has not sat, but only in the Torah of Adonai is his desire. And in his Torah he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree set into the ground near streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and whose leaf does not wither. And in whatever he does, he will succeed. Not so the wicked, who are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand up in judgment, nor the sinful in the assembly of the righteous. For Adonai regards the way of the righteous, and the way of the wicked will be lost. Now, you heard in the translation that I read an entirely masculine interpretation of the Hebrew. That's obviously the first problem with the Hebrew and the first problem with the translation. Hebrew itself is a gendered language, meaning it doesn't have a neutral form, although you should know that currently in Israel, in the queer community, there is a movement to create a queer Hebrew. And there's a fascinating development that's happening now within modern Hebrew speakers themselves to create a queer endings of verbs and nouns that would automatically. Could you try again? Hello? So in Hebrew, there is a gendered ending of all verbs are obvious, or mostly, except for the first person. And all nouns have gender, like some other languages, which English does not. So a table has a gender, a chair has a gender, a house has a gender, an apple has a gender. And now in modern Hebrew, there's attempts to queerify it and to both not just remove gender, because it's complicated. Gender does exist, and some of us might want to identify with masculine, some of us might want to identify with feminine, and some of us might not identify at all with either of those binary. So the question is, how do we maintain the fluidity of language and also encompass the entirety of our human experience, which is not just binary languages of gender? So that's the first issue, but let's start it with the first verse. Ashrei ha'ish asher lo yada ba'atzat risha'im uvederech chataim lo amad uvemoshav leitzim lo yashav. Can somebody who has a different translation than mine, because I don't think we were able to share the one I wanted to, read the first sentence of your translation?
I will.
Thank you.
Happy is the man who has not followed the counsel of the wicked, or taken the path of sinners, or joined the company of the insolent. That's the JPS translation.
Okay, thank you. So Ashrei Ha'ish. So Ashrei, let's talk about the word Ashrei. We know that word. Hold on, let me just, let's see, do we have that other? Yes. Okay, Ashrei. So Ashrei is first of all, I love that the entire book of Psalms starts with the word for happiness. It has a lot of different ways to understand what happiness means, but Ashrei Ha'ish. Let's for one moment remove the gender idea from ish to translate this as a human being. That the Psalm is giving us from the very beginning of the book of Psalms, what means happiness? Is the definition of happiness material wealth or fame or any external things like the family structures you have? So what does it mean? How is the psalmist teaching us what is happiness? What does it mean for a human being to experience contentment? And in our current mindfulness movement, the question of where does one find peace? Ashrei Ha'ish. So this psalm starts out the entire book of Psalms by giving us a roadmap from which we can begin to understand where is our centeredness, where is deep happiness, not superficial happiness, not superficial gratification, instant gratification, but where does one find depth of human contentment from? So the psalmist, the entire psalm helps us is an answer to this question. From where do we find our sense of happiness? Ashrei Ha'ish, asher lo halach ba'atzat risha'im. So this is amazing. I think this is an amazing verse. So a person is happy who does not follow the advice of the wicked. Now, why does the psalm begin somewhat with the negative? Don't follow the negative advice. Don't follow kind of the popular negative advice. Don't fall for what you hear around you as advice. Understand the ability to distinguish between advice, eitzah is advice, between advice or instruction that comes from a source. Look at the source from which you are getting your wisdom from. Now, it's interesting. It doesn't start by saying follow God, right? That would be, one would think, a holy text would say, how is a person holy? The one who follows God. The psalmist understands the human inclination. Our human inclination is to follow what we hear all around us. Our human inclination, oh my God, is to listen to, what's out on Twitter or Facebook or who we're listening to. So that becomes, the psalmist is first saying, interrupt what is kind of a natural instinct, to listen to the buzzes in your ear that tell you things that are coming from a source that is Risha'im. Rasha is an evil person or a person who does bad things. So don't listen to the advice. Don't listen to the words. Take yourself away. There's a famous Rashbam in Bereshit that says, Oy l'Rasha, oy l'shcheno. Woe unto the evil person, but woe also to their neighbor. Because guess what? The power of evil is that it influences everybody around them. And do we know that in today's world? Do we see that constantly? So the first thing the psalm is telling us, avoid listening to those who are coming from an evil place. Kind of analyze the source of the wisdom. And then the psalm goes on to say, Uvaderech chataim lo amad. And in the way, derech is a way of those who are chataim, those who are sinning, those who are missing the mark. Lo amad, do not stand. So the first thing is don't listen, don't take in, because words are what immediately will influence and most powerfully influence our behavior. So the first thing we have to do is analyze whose wisdom, whose advice, where are we listening to the words, the rhetoric that's swirling around? And then the second piece of advice the psalmist tells us is how to act. It's so interesting. I think this is thousands of years old, and it reflects all contemporary psychology, right? that we are affected profoundly by what we hear and what we take in, and then it influences the way we act. So the second thing is we have to watch how we act. Now, I want to pause for a second and talk. Yes, chata'im can be miss the mark because it's the same chet, a sin sometimes translated. We talk about chata'im all the time in Yom Kippur. Is the same word used if you use a bow and arrow and the arrow misses the bullseye. That's a chet, when you're trying to do something and you miss the mark. So chata'im don't stand where somebody who is acting in that way will be. So here's an interesting point I want to make about the structure of a psalm as a poem. The first thing is to approach the structure in the way we would look at poetry. It's not prose, it's poetry. And in biblical poetry, there are a couple of features that we will see over and over again, and I will refer to many times, which is that clauses, sometimes they're parallel, one half of the sentence and the second half of the sentence. And as Geoffrey indicated earlier, the ta'amim, the trup, helps us to read the sentence. So the trup marks will tell us kind of where the comma is, or where the division is between an entire phrase and the second or third phrase sometimes of a sentence. So for those of you who can read the trup marks, and now I've got to take off my glasses again, mine doesn't have the trup marks on the one this setting, but you'll see that after Risha'im, there's a pause. So the first piece of a biblical poem will then be reflected in the second clause, which somehow will comment on or enhance or bring out the meaning of the first clause. So in other words, if you were to write these as a poem, instead of, they're all different ways they're written, but you would imagine Ashrei Ha'ish Asher Lo Halach Ba'atzat Risha'im is one clause, and Uvederech Chata'im Lo Amad is a second clause, and the third is Uvemoshav Leitzim Lo Yashav is the third clause. So each of those clauses gives insight into the ones that came before. That's very classical for biblical poetry. And there will be many, 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 many examples throughout Tehillim that will show us this. So what I'd like to ask, the third part of this sentence, Uva Moshav Leitzim Lo Yashav. And Uva Moshav is a place where one sits. One could even say where one lives, but where one sits. Leitzim are lazy people. Leitzim are used throughout rabbinic literature. I'm going to pause on that for a second. Lo Yashav. So you see, each of these clauses starts out, Asher Lo Halach Ba'atzat Risha'im. Don't go by the advice of those who are evildoers. Uvaderech Chata'im Lo Amad. And in the ways of those who miss the mark and are not improving themselves, don't stand there. And thirdly, Uva Mashav Lotzim Lo Yashav. And in the places where lazy, and there are lots of, and we don't have time today for Leitzim, maybe we'll do more of that tomorrow. You'll see how long this is going to take us. Uva Mashav Leitzim, lazy people, don't sit. So we've got three instructions in this first sentence, this first pasuk alone. One, don't halach ba'atzat. Don't go along with the advice you hear, the gossip you hear, the words you hear, if it's coming from an evil person. Don't walk along or stand in the place of people who are missing the mark, who are not acting in the right way. And don't sit in the place, don't live in the place, don't remain, don't stay still in a place of those who are lazy. Sometimes that's translated scorn, but we'll get back to that. So this first pasuk is giving us, before the psalm can tell us what to do actively to be happy, to be content, to be deeply at peace with ourselves. It's warning us about three things we must avoid. Don't listen to bad advice. Don't imitate the behaviors of those who are missing the mark. And don't stay still. In other words, don't sit around, even if you think, okay, I'm not going to listen and I'm not going to behave that way, but I'm going to stay right here around the late seam. Don't do those three things. So we have to end for today. Wow, we began the first pasuk. This is what Torah study is like. And please add on to the chats. I haven't been able to read them while I'm teaching. Input you have, thoughts you have. And we'll continue tomorrow. But again, and Judy's going to end us with singing Esa Einai. And continue studying this psalm today. Read it through. Try to do it as slowly as I'm doing it. Ask questions. Look at different translations. Try to understand what the Hebrew means. And tomorrow we're going to pick up. We're staying with Psalm 1 for a while. So consider your homework today to study Psalm 1 in all different ways that you can. And Judy, would you lead us with Esa Einai from Psalm 121?
Sure. Please join me. Esa Einai el Harim, me'ayin yavo ezri. Esa Einai el Harim, me'ayin yavo ezri. Ezri. Ose Shemaya Ezri Adonai Ose
Thank you so much, everyone, and keep writing in your advice, and your reactions are very helpful. Blessings to you all. And by the way, tonight it's La Boheme with the Metropolitan Opera. And Rabbi Moskowitz's class on Musar will be later today. I think it's at 6:30. Take care, everyone. Blessings to you all. Stay healthy and keep reaching out to those around you with love and blessings.